The fall. The day was drawing to an end when a distant fishing boat drew a scratch across Pia's line of vision, interrupting the rhythm of her vigil. At first, it was no more than a pinpoint on the lens of her binoculars, a stationary speck, anchored on the far side of a confluence of many rivers. After a while, when the dot had grown a little, Pia saw that it represented a small canoe-like craft with a hooped covering at the rear. There seemed to be only one fisherman on board. He was going through the motions of casting a net, standing upright to make his throw and stooping to pull his catch in. Pia had now spent 3 hours in her on-effort position in the bow of the launch. With her binoculars fitted to her eyes, she had scanned the water, waiting for a flash of black or gray to break through the dun surface. But so far her vigil had gone unrewarded. She had had no sightings all afternoon, not one. There had been one hopeful moment, but it had ended with a glimpse of a gliding stingray shooting into the air, with its tail trailing behind it like a string of a kite. Soon afterwards there was another false alarm. Majida had come running up in great excitement, pointing and gesticulating, giving her the impression that he had seen a dolphin, but it turned out that his attention had been caught by a group of crocodiles that were sunning themselves on a mud bank. Majida's motives for bringing them to her notice were made evident when he rubbed his fingers together to let her know that he had deserved a tip. This had annoyed her, and she had brushed him off with a peremptory gesture. She had spotted the crocodiles long before him, of course. She had seen them when they were a couple of kilometers away. There were 4 of them, and they were huge. From tip to tail, the largest of them was probably about the same length as the launch. She had wondered what it would be like to encounter one of these monsters up close, and the thought had prompted an involuntary shudder. But this was all. She had seen nothing else of note. Even though she hadn't known what to expect, she had not foreseen as complete a blank as this. That these waters had once contained large numbers of dolphins was known beyond a doubt. Several 19th century zoologists had testified to it. The discoverer on the Gangetic dolphin, William Roxburgh, had said explicitly that the freshwater dolphins of the Ganges delighted in the labyrinth of rivers and creeks to the south and southeast of Calcutta. This was exactly where she was, and yet after hours of careful surveillance, she had still to spot her first dolphin. Nor had she seen many fishermen. Pia had been hoping that the trip would yield a few encounters with knowledgeable boat people, but such opportunities had been scarce today. She had seen many overcrowded ferries and steamers, but very few fishing boats, so few as to suggest that the area was off limits for fishing. The canoe-like craft in the distance was the first boat she had seen in a long time, and it was clear the launch would pass within a couple of 100 meters of it. She began to wonder if it was worth a detour. Reaching for her belt, Pia unhooked her rangefinder. The instrument had the look of a pair of truncated binoculars with 2 eyepieces at one end but only a single cyclopean lens at the other. She focused this lens on the fishing boat and pressed a button to get a reading of the distance between them. A moment later, to the accompaniment of an extraordinary beep, the instrument posted the answer: 1.1 kilometers. Pia could not see the fisherman clearly, but it seemed to her that he had the grizzled look of an experienced hand. Around his chin and mouth was a dusting of white that suggested stubble or a beard. There was some kind of turban wrapped around his head, but his body was bare except for a single twist of cloth, wound between his legs and around his waist. His frame was skeletal, almost wasted, in the way of a man who'd grown old on the water, slowly yielding his flesh to the wind and the sun. She had come across many such fishermen on other rivers, and they had often been sources of good tips and useful information. She decided it would be well worth her while to take a few minutes to show him her flashcards. Twice before she had asked for detours, but Mejda, who was steering, had grown increasingly hostile after the incident with the crocodiles. He had ignored her on both occasions, but this time she was determined to have her way. Mejda and the guard were in the boat's glass-fronted wheelhouse, sitting shoulder to shoulder. Stepping away from the bow, she turned to face the two men. Mejda was at the wheel, and he dropped his eyes on her approach. The furtiveness of his manner indicated all too plainly that he had been talking about her. Pulling out a flashcard, she went to the wheelhouse and positioned herself directly in front of Mejda. "Stop," she said, pressing an open palm on the glass. Mejda's eyes followed her finger to the boat, now clearly visible ahead. "Head over there," she said, "toward that boat. I want to see if he recognizes this." She held up the card in explanation. The wheelhouse door swung open and the guard stepped out, hitching up his khaki trousers. He made his way across the deck and leaned on the gunwale, shading his eyes. A frown appeared on his face as he squinted at the boat. Spitting into the water, he muttered something to the pilot. There was a quick exchange of words, and then Mejda nodded and spun the wheel. The bow of the launch began to turn in the direction of the boat. "Good," said Pia, but the guard ignored her. His attention was now wholly focused on the boat. The intensity of his expression puzzled her. There was a predatory look in his eye that made it hard to believe he was doing this solely out of deference to her wishes. In the distance, the fisherman was standing up to make another cast. The boat had stayed where it was, growing a little larger each time it crossed her line of vision. It was now less than a kilometer away, and she kept her binoculars strained on it as the launch turned. The fisherman had so far seemed unaware of their presence, but when it became apparent that the launch was changing course, he checked himself in the act of casting his net and turned to look in their direction. Suddenly his eyes flared in alarm. She could see them through her glasses, outlined against the darkness of his skin. He turned to one side and his lips seemed to move as though he were speaking to someone. Shifting focus, Pia saw that the fisherman was not alone in the boat, as she had thought. There was a child with him, a nephew or grandson. The boy was sitting crouched in the prow. She guessed it was he who had alerted the fisherman to the launch's approach. He was pointing in the direction and cowering, as though in terror. Within moments it became clear that both man and boy had taken fright. The man pulled out a pair of oars and began to row furiously, while the boy scurried down the length of the boat and hid under the hooped covering at its rear. The boat had been positioned some 50 meters from the mouth of a narrow creek, a distance that could be covered with a few dozen oak strokes. It was towards this opening that they were heading. The forest that lined the creek's banks had been half submerged by the tide, and the boat was small enough to give the launch the slip by heading directly into the mangroves. The water was still at a height where it would carry them deep into the forest in perfect concealment. They would be well hidden and would be able to make an escape. There was something about the situation that puzzled Pia. On the Irrawaddy and the Mekong too, Fishermen had sometimes taken fright at the prospect of being interrogated by strangers, especially when there was a whiff of an official connection. Yet she had never known a fishing boat actually to attempt an escape. Pia looked to her right. The guard was standing in the bow of the launch now, and his rifle was slung over his shoulder. He had fetched it while her attention was fixed on the boat. Suddenly the fisherman's response made sense. Turning on the guard, she stabbed a finger at his gun. "What's that for?" she said. "Why do you need that?" The guard ignored her, and she raised her voice. Put that gun away. It's not necessary." He waved her away with a brusque gesture and turned to shout something to Mejida. At once the pitch of the engine rose and the launch lurched forward, closing in on the boat. She understood now that the situation, although of her own making, was wholly outside her control and even her comprehension. The one explanation she could think of was that the fisherman had been working in an off-limits area, which might account for this pursuit. Whatever the reason, it was up to her to put a stop to this chase. Her work would be in jeopardy if word got out that she was interfering with local people. Turning to the wheelhouse, she signaled urgently to Mejida. "Stop! We're not going any further. This is it." She was about to walk over to him when the guard began to bellow at the boat. The rifle at his shoulder now upraised, and he was evidently threatening to open fire. She was appalled. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She rushed at him and lunged at his arm, trying to push away the barrel of the gun. He saw her coming and thrust out his elbow. It caught her in the collarbone and sent her reeling back. The display card went flying from her grip as she steadied herself, clutching her shoulder. The fisherman had stopped rowing now, and Mejida cut the engine as the launch pulled up to the boat. Shouting an order, the guard threw over a rope and the fisherman tethered it to his boat. The child, Pia noticed, was watching everything from his hiding place under the boat's hooped covering. The guard barked a question that elicited a muttered response from the fisherman. The answer was clearly much to the guard's liking, for he turned to Mejida and smiled, as if in satisfaction. The two men had a quick exchange of words, and then the guard turned to Pia and spat out the word "poacher" in a tone of accusation. "What?" said Pia. Even if she had been disposed to believe him, this charge would not have been credible. She shook her head dismissively. "He was just fishing. That's all he was doing." "Poacher," the guard said again, pointing his rifle at the fisherman. "Poacher." It was all clear to her now, just as she had thought. The fisherman had been casting his net in an off-limits area. He had chosen that spot so he would be able to get away if an official boat came along. He had assumed the launch to be just another tourist boat and hadn't realized until too late that there was an armed forest guard on board. Now he was going to have to pay either a bribe or a fine. The fisherman was standing warily upright in the boat, leaning on his oar. The sight of him startled Pia, for it was evident at close quarters that he was not at all the elderly gray-beard she had taken him to be. He was about her own age, in his late 20s. His frame was not wasted but very lean, and his long, stringy limbs were almost fleshless in their masculinity. Nor was it because of a beard that his chin sported a dusting of white. The flakes were salt crystals left behind by a long day's deposits of brackish water. His face was narrow and angular, and its gauntness seemed to exaggerate the size of his eyes. The cloth tied around his middle was no more than a faded rag, and it gave him his skeletal frame a look of utter destitution. Yet there was a defiance in his stance at odds with the seeming defenselessness of his unclothed chest and his protruding bones. He was watching the guard with wary eyes, as though he were trying to reckon exactly how much money he was going to lose. At least a week's earnings, Pia guessed, if not a whole month's. As if to remind her of her part in the situation, the guard stooped to pick her display card off the deck. He seemed to be in no hurry now that he had caught up with his prey. Handing her the card, he made gesture in the direction of the boat, urging her to show it to the fisherman. Pia could scarcely believe that he was asking her to carry on as if nothing had happened. She drew her hands back, shaking her head. He thrust the card at her again, and this time his rifle seemed to move with his arm, as if to prod her in the direction of the fisherman. She shrugged. "All right." Undoing her equipment belt, she stowed it in her backpack along with her binoculars. Then she picked up the display card and stepped up to the gunwale. The boat was directly below, tethered close to the launch, and the fisherman's face was now on level with her knee. On catching sight of her, the fisherman started. His attention had been focused on the guard, and he hadn't realized there was a woman on the launch. Her presence seemed to make him suddenly self-conscious. He reached for the cloth tied around his head and yanked it down. It sprang apart and fell around him, unrolling over his body like a curtain. When he had fastened it at the waist, she saw that the twist of cloth that she had taken to be a turban was, in fact, a rolled-up sarong. There was a consideration in this gesture, an acknowledgement of her presence, that touched her. It seemed like the first normal human contact she had had since stepping on the launch. Despite the strangeness of the circumstances, she was eager to see his response to the pictures. She lowered herself to one knee, and when their heads were level, she held out the card. She tried to give him a smile of reassurance, but he would not meet her eye. He glanced from the card to her face and raised a hand to point upriver. The gesture was so quick and matter-of-fact that for a moment she thought he had misunderstood. Then she looked into his eyes, and he nodded, as if to say, "Yes, that's where I saw them." "But which ones?" She thrust the card at him again, expecting that he would point to the picture of the Gangetic dolphin, the more common of the two pictures. To her astonishment, his finger dropped to the illustration of the Irrawaddy dolphin, or Achella breviratoris. He said something in Bengali and held up 6 fingers. "6?" she said. She was now very excited. "You are sure?" She was interrupted by a child's cry. Looking up, she saw that the guard had taken advantage of her conversation with the fisherman to board the boat. Now he was rifling through the possessions that lay bundled under the hooped covering. The child was cowering against the side of the boat, clutching his hand to his chest. With a sudden lunge, the guard caught hold of the child and pried his hands open. Evidently the boy had been trying to conceal a thin wad of banknotes. The guard tore the money from his grip and slipped it into his own pocket. Then he gave the boy a parting slap and climbed back into the launch. Pia, looking on from above, suddenly recalled her own wad of money, stashed in the money belt she was wearing around her waist. She undid the zip surreptitiously, slipped her hand in, and pulled out a handful of notes. Rolling them tight in her palm, she waited until the launch had started up again. When the guard had turned his back, she leaned over the side and stretched her arm towards the fisherman. "Here, here." She kept her voice low, and it was drowned out by the hammering of the engine. Now a wedge of water had opened up between the boat and the launch, but she felt sure she would be able to throw the money over if only she could climb a little higher. There was a plastic chair nearby and she pushed it to the side of the deck. Then she climbed up, balancing her weight against the gunwale. Here! She threw over the money and accompanied it with a loud hissing sound. This time she succeeded in catching the fisherman's attention, and he jumped to his feet in surprise. But the guard had heard her too, and he came barreling across the deck. One of his feet crashed into the chair, throwing her forward, tipping her weight over the gunwale. Suddenly she was falling, and the muddy brown water was rushing up to meet her face.